I'm Joshua Carritt-Baker, and I'm going to be doing this talk today with Matt Bell. I'll let him introduce himself later when more people have joined, because I think there's probably a few that are going to come in. Maybe just as a starter, because we're going to be talking a fair bit about science today, because I guess the key theme of the work I do, and in particular kind of tackling issues around the diagnosis and misdiagnosis of neurodevelopmental conditions, is that we're in the business of the application of science. This doesn't relate directly to that, although it is. You'll see the connection in a minute, and it's about understanding. So during the 20th century, you can see. So this is in the US, but actually it's similar in the UK and other developed countries. This is a graph of the violent crime rate throughout the latter part of the 20th century, and it goes up to a peak in about 1990. And then it came back down again. And there's a particular explanation for this. And at the time, obviously, when violent crime rate was going up and up and up during it started in the 60s, but then in the 70s and in particularly the 80s, there were an awful lot of things that were put forward as being the cause of more violence in society generally. Things like, it's the result of the 1960s, and it's just some sort of social change, and etc, etc, etc. In fact, a lot of things that were put forward were in the bottom bit, in the light red area. So people talking about poverty and race, and bearing in mind this is from America in particular, drugs, policing, guns. Well, actually, all of those factors in the end only really explains the bit that's the kind of light red bit at the bottom, and something else explained the huge rise. So it goes, whatever that figure is, I don't know quite, crimes per million or whatever, goes from 300 up to 800 and then sort of back down again. And something in particular explained that, and we know that from science. And this is really just a bit of a kind of introduction, partly to cover a few minutes while people are joining at the beginning, in terms of thinking about how we find things out from science and the importance of doing so. Does anyone, you're welcome to post something in the chat. There may be people here who know the answer. I think if you know the answer, you know it. What is it that explains that huge rise in violent crime in the 20th century, and then why it came back down again? Does anyone want to hazard a guess? Matt, I'll pick on you. Well, go on. Okay, so we've got one guess: economic deprivation. Okay, that's a fair enough guess. That's like what people thought.
I'm going to guess science, doctor.
Science was the cause of the
decline. Science was the cause of decline. I'm going to go medication.
Yeah, okay. And then we've got undiagnosed. So for those of you, there's a few people are posing things in the chat, or the conversation thing. So if you haven't got that, you can click on the little speech bubble. Yeah, so undiagnosed neurodevelopmental disorders, crime reporting. Okay, yeah, kind of perfectly reasonable things. Okay, it's now 5:35, and I've killed the first 5 minutes, which was partly the aim of this, to give people a chance to join. So the answer is leaded petrol. This is why the United Nations regard tackling lead in petrol as being either the most important or the second most important public health measure after the eradication of whatever illness it was that they eradicated, which I now can't remember. But anyway, this is one of their, this is up there with their, yeah, again, wow, I didn't know that, someone said, yeah, not many people do, and it's an incredible story. So this is why we have unleaded petrol. Yeah, so at the beginning of the 20th century, lead was put into petrol in order to stop what's called engine knocking. It made engines last longer. It sort of was like a lubricant. And actually, it seems like they knew that. Well, it was known that lead was poisonous. That wasn't a secret, and there was a kind of concerted effort to not let people find out about that. And then it took all that time and all that violent crime in order for unleaded petrol to be introduced. And then actually, there was like a 20-year delay. Basically, lead is bad for your developing brain. And we're going to be talking a fair bit about developing brains today, because we are talking about neurodevelopment. But the effect of lead is to make you more aggressive and violent. And that is why we have that picture of violent crime, not just in the US, but in the UK as well. So mainly we're going to be talking not about lead, but about child mental health and neurodevelopment. And I would say I think there's a crisis. That's kind of what stories in the newspaper would tell us. You also perhaps know that from being parents. You also know that from perhaps working in the area or reading the research. And I'm going to be just telling you a bit about what that crisis is about, and why actually there's a whole issue about regulation, which is at the core of this. If I'm distracted, it's because I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat things as well, because I quite like to answer questions as we go. I'm not wedded to my PowerPoints by any stretch. So what's this problem all about? Okay, take the general population. There are lots of children with problems to do with words and number relationships, handwriting, processing streams of information, dealing with social groups, inhibiting their impulses, maintaining attention. Okay, these are all the neurodevelopmental disorders. And basically, you've just taken an area of brain development and say, well, it can go wrong, and that then is a neurodevelopmental disorder, a neurodevelopmental condition. And there are loads of ways in which they can go wrong, so they're quite common. And they just happen for no other reason than it's just biogenetic variability. And they're quite strongly associated with other things like mental health problems. And you can go around all the other things that you like, social media or screen time. Yeah, none of those actually, in the scheme of causality, none of those come close to just inherent variability in terms of understanding, in terms of understanding kind of why children experience problems. Okay, so then what we do is we construct an education system that is in effect kind of intrinsically discriminatory towards these children. Yeah, and the reason I say that is because I think in many ways it is, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission have previously funded a legal project to try to address this widespread discrimination. And I suppose in essence what we're talking about are things like, you just, if you design the education system around the neurotypical group, and then, or the neurotypical population, and then don't have the full range of adjustments that are needed in order to cater for neurotypicality before children move over into special education, those children in this area who are the ones, the neuroatypical ones who are trying to be maintained in mainstream education, they're the ones that get it. So then the other thing is that we've trained a load of professionals who might come into contact with these children. We've just basically trained them so that they don't always have much of an idea about what the research says about what these problems are and how common they are. So this is, neurodevelopmental issues. And in particular, we've told them that trauma and attachment are of such fundamental importance that actually those are the ones that those are the things that you need to focus on. It's not about just understanding the basics of human brain development. It's something else on the whole. Yeah, so mostly they'd be thinking that it's something to do with parenting. Broadly speaking, this is the parent blaming thing that I referred to in the first talk, which is kind of really the focus of this talk. So then you take a child that's already having problems and you give them to those professionals to be helped, but then you don't do a proper systematic assessment based on the research, and then you apply a framework that's inappropriate to that child or family, And as that framework suggests that the problems are something to do with the family. And then you watch how everything gets worse, and you tell the parents they need to change more, and you go round and round in circles. Okay, so what are these things, you know, when we're talking about attachment, what are these things that are being referred to? Well, the slides at the end, and there's a whole document I've written about the sort of jumble of language that's used in relation to things like attachment and trauma and so on. But the diagnosable condition that relates to attachment is reactive attachment disorder. And the bit I've highlighted there tells you that the child has to have experienced the pattern of extremes of insufficient care, as evidenced by social neglect or deprivation in the form of persistent lack of having basic emotional needs met, or repeated changes of primary caregiver, or rearing in an orphanage, or, you know, basically in the Romanian orphanages that you may have seen, you know, historically, where children were in awful conditions. Okay, this does not affect many children, right? About 10% of severely neglected children have reactive attachment disorder. And there isn't another attachment disorder that loads of other children have, right? Because if only 10% of very neglected children have the disorder, right, it's hard to get. You know, you can't easily induce this in children. So when you hear people talking about attachment as a general explanation for childhood difficulties, broadly speaking, it will just be wrong. Yeah, because they will very, very rarely be talking about children who meet those criteria. And this is a key issue in terms of, you know, what is it that happens when children with problems present for assessments. They get pushed down some more general, like what you might call psycho-emotional type route of, oh, is it attachment? Is it this? It is almost always not. Yeah, very, very, very rarely will it be something clearly to do with attachment. And you notice here, this is the key point being that here that it's a exclusion diagnosis for autism is an exclusion diagnosis for an attachment disorder. In other words, when you're looking at severely neglected children, they might have reactive attachment disorder, but they might also have autism. And if they've got autism, then you can't diagnose reactive attachment disorder. And that's it. You can only talk about this in relation to severely neglected children, not in relation to the general population of people who are just, you know, having difficulties and presenting at CAMHS or wherever for an assessment in relation to those difficulties. There's another similar thing called disinhibited social engagement disorder. This is where children just sort of go up to, you know, strangers and they're over familiar. And, you know, similarly, it's very rare. 20% of very neglected children. So, you know, I've seen endless times, particularly in social care cases, where, you know, they're like, kid doesn't seem to be aware of strangers. We think they've been neglected. Well, it's possible, but that's really rare. Yeah, it doesn't happen very often. It's quite common when children have autism or ADHD. Yeah, the impulsivity and lack of social awareness and so on will mean that they'll approach strangers. So it's much more common with autism and ADHD, and it's very rarely going to be DSED. Okay, so then we go to things like, so another one is disorganized attachment. This is a research paper written by like 40 or 50 odd scientists about the use of disorganized attachment, basically saying it's been misapplied. Some misapplications have accrued. They can result from erroneous assumptions, etc., etc. I mean, this is kind of in line with what I was saying, except it's about a slightly different set of issues to do with disorganized attachment. And basically, these misapplications are likely to selectively harm already underprivileged families. In other words, if you're already relatively poor or under stress, yeah, you're more likely to have things going on that are, you know, disorganized attachment isn't a disorder. This is the point they're making. It's just an attachment pattern, and you know, it's not indicative of abuse or neglect in a very straightforward way by any stretch. And as they say, then the misapplication of this can violate children's and parents' human rights. How does it do that? Well, it's used as a way of removing children from families, yeah, straightforwardly. Yeah, and that's, you know, violation of right to a family, and it's done because it's a misapplication of this sort of disorganized attachment model, and represents discriminatory practice against minorities in need of social and material support. So this is the attachment research community saying how disorganized attachment has been misused in recent years. And I would say actually it's not just disorganized attachment. I mean, they've picked on that, but it's just the entirety of the attachment model that you could apply what they're saying to. And in fact, so that was recent research, but it goes back. We know, for example, in this book from 2006, written by Pryor and Glaser, who are, you know, eminent child development experts, and Dania Glaser's wrote one of the key kind of early papers about kind of contact in the child contact, you know, when there's domestic abuse and so on. She's advised the high courts about these issues. You know, she's an eminent expert. And in 2006, they were saying there are two discourses on attachment disorder. There's the scientific one based on disciplined scientific inquiry, and then there's the alternative discourse. Sorry, is found in some clinical practice. Well, I would say since 2006, in the last 15 years, the alternative discourse, which they say makes passing reference to Bowlby, who's the founder of the attachment model, and passing reference to the academic literature, and proceeds to make claims which have no basis in attachment theory. Okay, that's not now some clinical practice. That is probably most clinical practice in relation to children with problems. And as they say, most worryingly, quite unfounded claims are made for the efficacy of alternative attachment therapies. And we'll come on to that, and why they say most worryingly. We'll come on to that in a bit. In fact, we'll come on to it now. So this is about, and I'm just, before we go through this slide, but just partly this is about the thing of what is the problem? A lot of the time people talk about funds and resources. Well, in part, it's about, of course, you know, lots of things are about funds and resources, but we can see, what we'll see in a second, is that if you throw money at a problem, but you do it in a completely unscientific way, you can make the situation worse. And basically, I don't know what the total is now, but I think it was certainly tens of millions of pounds has been devoted to the Adoption Support Fund. This is a project aimed at supporting families of adopted children. The whole project is basically predicated on the idea that adopted children have experienced such significant neglect or abuse that they have disorders of, you know, relating to neglect and abuse, attachment disorders or other sorts of problems. Yeah. Relatively few children who are adopted in the UK have experienced anything like that level of neglect or abuse. You know, lots of children are removed before that happens, or they're removed quite early on. You know, some of that neglect or abuse may have happened, but not enough to cause those disorders. So we now have a system in place that's spent tens of millions of pounds providing therapies for disorders of neglect and abuse that don't exist. You know, those children do not have those problems. And we know those children don't have the problems because we know what the research says about the kinds of problems that adopted children have. By far, the majority, or the largest number of in terms of kids with problems, it's neurodevelopmental issues. Yeah. And then we also know that what's being done with in the adoptions through the Adoption Support Fund doesn't work, because the evaluation that was done in 2007 says so. A bit at the bottom, this suggests that the scores in the survey show changes that are lower than would be expected if no intervention had been applied. In other words, the children that received the interventions did worse than the children who didn't receive any interventions. Yeah, the interventions are counterproductive. And if you go back to what Pryor and Glaser are saying, you know, why did they say most worryingly quite unfounded claims are made for the efficacy of alternative attachment therapies? Well, because they don't work if you misapply them. You know, they may not even work if they were applied correctly. We don't even know that they're efficacious. But if you give kids with neurodevelopmental disorders those therapies, you know, you very often make them worse. The issue being, of course, that it's not just children it's not just adopted children with neurodevelopmental conditions who are being given those sorts of therapies. It's also just children who are presenting at CAMHS, for example. They are generally or very frequently being provided with therapies that relate to other sorts of problems other than neurodevelopmental conditions. So this isn't the only example. I just put this in. It occurred to me I know of other examples, at least 2 or 3, where the science tells us that something is counterproductive. Yeah, there's the sex offender treatment, which at best didn't work and actually looks like it may have been counterproductive. And we also know about the issue of sort of automatic debriefing after traumatic events. If after a traumatic event you get everyone together to talk about it, it's not a good idea. Okay, most people just recover spontaneously, and actually getting people to debrief in the way that has historically been done is often counterproductive. So I'm going to just quickly show you. So what I'll do is I'll put the link in the. So there's a group, and I'm going to put the link to it in the chat before we finish. It's just the summary document that I've written that covers all these issues. So it goes through understanding that, you know, when people talk about attachment disorder, they are very rarely using it correctly. I mean, I'm struggling to think of a time when I've seen it used correctly, actually. And I did a lot of child protection assessments, and really very, very few times would it have even been appropriate to apply it based on the criteria of the levels of neglect that children need to have experienced. And then we've got disinhibited social engagement disorder. That's not an attachment disorder. Again, it's very rare. Then we've got this is much more common, where people are talking about attachment difficulties. And this is the one where, you know, in terms of kids that we see, when if they've been to CAMHS before they come to see us, it's very, very common that it will be described as an attachment difficulty. It has no kind of established meaning, and in fact is, you know, well researched as being just wrong. You know, there isn't a kind of thing that is this, you know, attachment disorder light or whatever. I mean, there's no kind of way in which that can be applied to significant numbers of the population in the way that it is. And you know, the confusion comes because of this underlying thing, going back to what I was saying before about, look, yeah, reactive attachment disorder and autism can look quite similar to one another, but you can only really think about that in the population of children who are very neglected. In the kind of general population, it's just not applicable. But what's happened is, for various reasons, it's become the runaway idea. You know, this thing that there is this, you know, children that experience a mixture of kind of social and behavioural difficulties that are basically autism, that can be explained through some sort of attachment model. It just can't. Yeah, there is no established attachment model, and the research community keeps saying this. You know, it's not the research that we looked at before. It's not the only. They're not the only examples of this in terms of the research community, but it sort of makes no difference to, you know, clinical practice and you know, and in fact training. This is something that we'll come on to in a second. Sorry, this is very small, but you then got the issues about disorganized attachment, which we talked about, which is another area that then is kind of often sort of cited. There's the other one, which is so, and I don't know, you may be able to read it. So the other thing that's come up more recently, so back in 2006, we already had the development of attachment as a misused model, and then quite soon that started to be kind of probably overtaken actually in the end by the idea of trauma and developmental trauma in particular. So developmental trauma is a it's a framework that's been put forward by Van der Kolk, who was behind kind of establishing complex trauma as a sort of recognised diagnostic framework. Developmental trauma basically says if you significantly mistreat a child, and in particular that they're exposed, that they are abused rather than neglected, that then you will cause disruptions in their brain functioning. Yeah, you will basically cause neurodevelopmental problems essentially. And okay, there's some things appearing in the chat, so I will come to those in a second. So this idea has taken hold, and now you will just see lots of things. So when kids are sort of, particularly when they're rather dysregulated, and it's maybe not clearly autism, but a mixture of things and so on, it'll just get called, and any history, the sort of the history of, it's not like you have to have a significant history of family problems in order for this to be put forward as an idea. Going back to the what those researchers said, if you're poorer, from a lower socioeconomic group, you're just way more likely to have these kind of models applied to you. And so developmental trauma is postulated as this thing that could explain disrupted neurodevelopment in children who have experienced trauma, abuse and so on. It could. I mean, it's not that that's somehow impossible. It's just that it's a million miles away from being a scientifically established and validated model. And the reason is that you run into the problem of, look, children that are significantly neglected or abused very frequently come from families where there are high rates of neurodevelopmental disorders. So how you factor out causality amongst that population group is, that's a massive question. And it's quite possible that developmental trauma will never get to the status of being like, okay, yeah, this seems like it's something that we can reasonably rely on, for the simple reason that you would never be able to distinguish it from ordinary biogenetic neurodevelopmental problems. Yeah, there would be no way in which you could reliably do that. And if you look at the proposed criteria, so it's only, there's just some proposed criteria that have been written by the sort of Van der Kolk team. If you look at the proposed criteria, it's just a list of neurodevelopmental symptoms. So how you would possibly know that these were caused by the events in childhood is beyond me. Yeah, and I just think it's never going to, in anything like its current form, it's never going to be established as a reliable diagnosis. And even if it was, it would only then apply to, small numbers of children. Yeah, it would be like a reactive attachment disorder. They would have to have been significantly mistreated, and it probably would only apply to a percentage of those. And that's even if we were able to establish it as a reliable diagnosis. So where you see people talking about developmental trauma, you can be 100% of the time you can be suspicious, because there is no established diagnosis of developmental trauma. It's not even like reactive attachment disorder, where it could be in theory. Yeah, there's nothing that there's nothing that you can point to as reliable criteria. Yeah, it's not reached that stage, and yet you'll see developmental trauma talked about routinely in CAMHS and Child Development Service reports. I've seen it several times, and it's never right, even on a kind of theoretical basis. But it's not right because it's not an established diagnosis, and there are all sorts of problems with it. The other one, so then, because it sort of relates to this thing of complex PTSD. So this is PTSD is, you have an accident or whatever and you develop post-traumatic symptoms. Complex PTSD is where you've had a series of traumatic events, usually throughout childhood, and that's now established as it's an ICD-11 diagnosis, and it's reasonably robust and it makes sense. It's like, yeah, look, if you've experienced lots of trauma in childhood, then it's quite possibly going to result in a complicated mix of psychological problems. Never, that's not in any dispute. This is more about kind of really characterizing the nature of those problems, and in particular it's that historically people would often have been diagnosed with a personality disorder, and there was a big push to say, look, you got to understand these things as being a function of trauma. And it's like, yeah, fair enough. And in fact, it's kind of what my doctoral dissertation was on, was on this issue. Very, very, very different to the idea that you can develop a reliable model of developmental trauma disorder. Yeah, those are very, very different sorts of things. Okay, so that's the end of the slides, which sort of finished a bit abruptly because I thought it would be helpful to then just answer questions that people have, or think about the comments that might want to be made. So yeah, so someone says SENDCo would not consider any other diagnosis other than attachment disorder. Yeah, I mean, and you make the point that obviously the SENDCo is not qualified to say that, and in any case, even if someone was qualified, as I've said, it's extremely unlikely to be applicable. You know, and it's only going to be applicable if in situations where children have experienced prolonged, pervasive neglect. Yeah, so even amongst amongst the population of the Romanian adoptees who were rescued from Romanian orphanages and had been kept in absolute squalor throughout their early childhood, some reasonable percentage of those had something like reactive attachment disorder. Certainly wasn't all of them, and that's like the most neglected population of children that I think have ever been studied. It was a few tens of percent rather than the 10% that you might tend to see in kind of the UK neglected population. But anyway, the point being, it's rare. It's difficult to cause an attachment disorder. It is far, far more likely to be autism or a neurodevelopmental condition, and that is just a ordinary variation in biogenetics. It's just how we're made. So I know Matt is also going to talk today. I forgot to ask Matt, actually, how long did you want to talk for? Because we're about halfway through our allotted hour.
We are.
But I don't know, because sometimes at this point there's suddenly a flurry of comments or questions. I suppose the other thing that I hadn't touched on was this point about regulation, professional regulation. But my view is that these things are utterly, you know, perfectly describable as just professional failures. Yeah, there's no kind of, these aren't differences of opinion. It's not you know, differences of professional opinion. It is, in essence, it is the research community saying you're doing it wrong and you must stop doing this, and then the clinical community saying, well, sort of just in effect ignoring that and carrying on as they like. Yeah, and to call that a difference of professional opinion is absurd, because, you know, professional opinions, sort of by definition, a professional opinion should be based on evidence. It's not just an opinion that you pluck out the air. And you know, there is no research evidence to support the position that clinicians adopt. It's not like they have reasonable supporting evidence. I've not just kind of missed off all the research that supports their position. There isn't research to support their position. There's an awful lot of stuff that's written about it in a general sense, but there is no research that is going to overturn the essentially the long history, the well-established kind of history of the research that's been done into these disorders. Yeah, that is sort of impossible, because you cannot go from a situation where, you know, only a small percentage of children can have reactive attachment disorder to a situation where lots of them have it. Yeah, that's just not something that can happen. So in terms of things established by science, it is a fact. Yeah, in as much as we ever get a fact in relation to these sorts of things. Yeah, it's a fact that lots of children do not have attachment disorders. That's just a scientific fact, but it's one that isn't ignored just routinely by people working in these areas. So everyone has gone very quiet in the chat, so I'm going to hand over to you, Matt, and you can take it away.
Thanks. So just in case you weren't here last time, I'm Matt Bell. I'm an educational consultant. I've overseen the SEND development of a hub of schools across Surrey and Sussex, predominantly dealing with ASD in one of the schools and SEMH in the other schools. The question of attachment and trauma comes up quite a lot, having SEN schools. Most often the question comes up where the child has social, emotional, mental health difficulties, and they haven't yet received a formal diagnosis either of ADHD or ASD. And when I'm working with MPA, one of the most common requests and consultations that we get is that there's been a disagreement between the family and the school. And what we talked about last time that we met was the importance of early diagnoses and how key that is, but also the amount of time that it takes to get the diagnoses at the moment. And maybe we'll touch on it later, also about the difficulties of having independent or private diagnoses and going over to CAMHS at the moment for ratification. But what most often occurs, especially when there's a risk of provision breakdown within a school and the child is still young, is that there's significant disagreements and that there's a relationship breakdown either between the family and the school and the local authority, or the family and the local authority. Unfortunately, that's more common than what it needs to be. And what we encourage to do is to get back to that first point of where there has been a relationship breakdown. So when we're talking about attachment and ADHD, there is a lot of discourse around attachment and trauma at the moment, and a lot of information floating about there. There's been multiple books published recently on dealing with attachment in the classroom, dealing with trauma in the classroom being a trauma-informed practice, and in essence, being a trauma-informed practice or a trauma-informed school, as long as it's not direct intervention, is an understandable thing. It's about being child-centered and building a provision around the child and recognizing where they're at. And in essence, that's absolutely fine. You're listening to your child, you're understanding the child, you're supporting the child, you're making adjustments for the child. But where that starts to break down is when it stops being collaborative and it starts being adversarial. And what we see is usually one of three areas, and it can happen from the families sometimes, and it can happen from the school sometimes. And it's what is called preaching, politicking, or prosecuting. Okay, when a school is preaching, say for instance somebody's put in the chat about that the school believes that it's attachment and don't want to put forward a request to CAMHS, and they're basically doubled down on their viewpoints. They become entrenched, they become defensive around their viewpoints as if they've been questioned, and largely that's about a fear that they've got something wrong. Sometimes it's around a lack of understanding, or they have received further education or continued professional development around this area, and it meets the criteria that's been set out for them. Sometimes they become defensive and they don't double down, and they become quite protective and prosecute the families, or the families attempt to prosecute the school or the local authority. And in that I mean that it's absolutely the school's fault, or absolutely the LA's fault, or absolutely the family's fault. That in itself can cause a lot of problems for the child. But perhaps the one that goes on for longest is politicking. And that's where sometimes we might get a SENDCo or even a family agree with the school or the SENDCo agree with the family, but they're not actually enacting anything. They're listening to them, and they're agreeing, and they're very supportive, and oh yes, it's very difficult. And the most concerning one around politicking is that years can elapse and that there's no intervention put in place, and that it's all very understanding, and the provision that the child requires isn't put in place. And when we talked about last time about, you know, how to support the schools, how to support the family, how to support the local authority and maintaining the relationship, is about being scientific. It's about having SMART goals as quickly as possible, something that's very specific, something that's very measurable. And when we're talking about time bonding, we're really only talking about a time bond of 6 weeks. For something quite intensive to be put in place, you know, something very specific, something very outcome driven, to see what happens. And it's about asking these questions. It's about asking what the evidence is. It's about asking the families about what their evidence is, what their belief systems are. It's about asking the school about what the evidence is. And one of the things where it really goes wrong is where a family try to request, or sometimes, you know, where they might try and prosecute the school, not in a formal sense, but in a metaphorical sense, that they haven't put enough in place. And they get a lot of reports, and they try to put a lot of things in place all at once. And now that doesn't mean that those things aren't right. They are right, that they've been assessed either by a psychologist or a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist. But it's not clear how they're going to be able to support that child in being able to achieve those outcomes, because the school might have been supportive of the family. Oh yes, you know, do get those reports, and then it all gets sent in a bundle to the local authority, and those SMART targets, those interventions haven't been put in place, so there's no understanding what's working in any type of environment. And that's where we sometimes will support schools to get those early assessments done, those cognitive ability tests done, the behavioural attainment scales done, so we can see what their strengths are, what their areas of difficulties are, and if the SENDCo has done enough CPD, that they have the ability to do these assessments themselves. But they give us something very concrete and something very scientific to work from. And as long as they've done the qualifications, these can be run out relatively quickly. And when they get sent over for a private assessment or an assessment with CAMHS, all of these can be sent over, and it gives very concrete information from which to work from. If the SENDCo hasn't done the further CPD and they haven't done the further training, is that there are electronic ones like GL assessments, and these are ratified by the BPS, and they're accepted ways of doing things, and they give us some concrete information from which to start from, to be able to then start to build some very specific targets. But what we're talking about here is for no side to either try and, you know, prosecute somebody else, politic the other, or preach to the other, but it is about asking questions. It is about seeking evidence, trying to understand and asking, well, how do you know that? How did you get to that point? What evidence is sitting behind these things? And often people aren't used to that, and sometimes they can feel that you're critiquing their professionalism, you're critiquing their understanding, especially if they're professionally qualified. But it's important, and developing that relationship and helping them understand that you're not doing it in a way to question their authority or question their professional qualifications, but it's literally about trying to understand what it is that child needs to be able to basically evolve their views, to be able to use logic and data to come to an understanding of the child, to be able to put interventions in place. And that really helps us understand what the strengths of the child are. It's not just the strengths of the child of what they've been able to develop of their own volition, it's also the strengths of the child in how they've been able to access an intervention. Because that's what's tapped into when the intervention is successful. You're operating on an area of strength as well as an area of weakness at the same time. You're doing it in very small bursts. Sometimes I might receive an EHCP, although it's much rarer these days, where there'll be 36 outcomes or 50 outcomes on an EHCP. And I sit down with the family and say, which ones would you like me to deliver first? If I was able to deliver one outcome a week in a school, I wouldn't get it done in a year. I've only got a 38-week year, and even then, you know, we'd be moving heaven and earth, and they'd never be in the classroom. They'd be receiving interventions all the time. And to get everybody in a place where they're ready to agree, that's the one that we get consulted on a lot. Once all the reports are in, how do we get to a point of agreement across all parties? And this comes up an awful lot, and it's just taking it a bit at a time and setting those outcomes. And one thing that that I haven't touched on is, if we go back to an earlier point about what Josh was making about attachment and ADHD, one of the real questions that comes up is about what are the parents doing? And that's one thing that comes up in tribunal, not often, but enough to make me aware of it, where somebody asks a question about what the parents do, and sometimes the parents offer to do things. And a provision set out by a parent can't be within section F of an EHCP. It has to be an educational provision. A parent may do something, a parent may support, but they can't be an educational provision of themselves. So at that point, we then take a step back and say, well, who delivers the provision? What should that provision be? What are their needs? What do we want their outcomes to be? And really, what's reasonable? And I can see a question there about support plans. I'll read it in depth in a second, but it's those early support plans. It's getting that evidence in early. You know, if a child is having difficulty, getting that support plan in quickly and to be able to see what's happening. And quite often, I will get a child, you know, year 3, year 4, and one of the most interesting things happened to me a couple of years ago, where we were getting in children year 3, year 4 predominantly, and we were doing a big project across the whole school around books. And with our year 7 and 8, they were writing their book, and we gave them all these picture books to look at, and they were obsessed with these picture books. And it took us, you know, a day to discuss it and figure out why do they love them so much. And we realized that that early years foundation, that year 1, they hadn't been shown picture books. They hadn't been read the picture books. They'd had all these interventions outside of class, but never that intervention to help them integrate. They'd almost overdone the interventions, and they loved them, but they'd missed out on those early childhood experiences. And that again tells us that it's not necessarily attachment. They've just missed out on these experiences. And we are living in the most intensely stimulating time that children have ever lived in. And, you know, with electronics and incredible books, incredible experiences. And they want to go and see things. And if they have neurodevelopmental difficulties, ADHD, and they have impulse control, and they're going to go in to get these things. They want this stimulus. They want to absorb it. And it's not that it can be misdiagnosed, but if the scientific basis of looking at things at a very early stage isn't followed through and relationships aren't maintained, that's where we see children have difficulties over a longer term.
Matt, I was you referred to that comment, and I was going to say, I was going to ask you to read it, and then while you're reading it, I'm going to go back to ones just above, just to say, yeah. So this issue about the acceptance. So when people talk about, do CAMHS accept a private assessment diagnosis? The reason why that is so difficult is entirely bound up with the whole thing that I was explaining about. If you're a clinician or a CAMHS service that works on a model where you think you are seeing, attachment problems everywhere, and they're really just not attachment problems. But if you think you're seeing attachment problems everywhere, and then someone else says, look, these aren't attachment problems, these are autism or ADHD, that's where the problem happens. And it's very difficult. The issue is it's very difficult to then reach a point of agreement, because in essence, you've got groups of people who are working according to the science, and then groups of people that are not. And until those people that are not working according to the science shift, there's going to be ongoing disagreement, and that's where this whole issue of acceptance of kind of private reports often comes from. And just in terms of so the attachment aware school, I mean, I thought I had when you were talking about that, Matt, is I mean, actually, because when I look at all the literature about that, I think this all makes sense. This is all good stuff in terms of just how we might want to interact with children. But the problem is, I think that it comes in, it ends up as a kind of substitute for proper assessment of the underlying problems. So you've got the school of 1,600 kids. This many kids will have neurodevelopmental conditions. They're not being properly assessed. And then all that's being applied is the attachment aware or trauma aware kind of school framework, and that doesn't address the neurodevelopmental issues. It just might at best mean that teachers, for example, think differently about how to interact with children, which is not a bad thing. It's just not what's needed. Is the problem that I have with the kind of attachment and trauma aware school models, and the sort of big drive that's gone on in relation to that in recent years. So there's that comment. The support plan question.
So I mean, there's so much tied up in what you're saying. If I deal with the technical part really about SEN and SEND law, and where it says if he doesn't start engaging, they're not going to do anything until he starts engaging. That would be the child providing their own provision. So that would be the child going, okay, I have SEN, I have a difficulty, I'm going to stop that now and start engaging, and then I'm going to receive help. So in essence, that can't work. It defeats the purpose of everything. What is likely to happen, as he undergoes assessment, you're going to get a clearer picture on his level of his type of need, and it is also level of need, the significance of that need, which is also just as important as the type of diagnosis that a child gets. But regardless of whether a child has a diagnosis or not, the Equalities Act is really quite clear on this, is that adjustments have to be made, and one of those adjustments is a support plan. Okay, and it's about asking questions, setting outcomes in terms of what a child can deal with. One of the things that sometimes comes to me from schools, from teachers, is how can I possibly do this? I have a classroom of 30 to 35 children. How can I possibly be scientific about this? How can I possibly know what the level of engagement is? And what we work on is swapping it around, is saying, set an outcome, set it for 5 minutes, set it for 10 minutes, set it for half a day, set it for a morning. Have a look at the times where the engagement is high, and have a look at the time where the engagement is low. It's not a reasonable adjustment isn't about creating a new provision. A reasonable adjustment is about adjusting slightly to see what is working. And then if that is working, keeping that going. It's possible that these reasonable adjustments don't add up to a provision over time, and that can happen, and then they require a larger provision. But until the school is able to set some type of outcome of what they are working towards, there's no way of knowing whether that's going to be successful. And also doesn't help things moving forward, because once you get a report from MPA and, you know, and that perhaps CAMHS need to ratify it or the local authority need to ratify it, they're still going to need evidence from the school in terms of what they've put in place. They need to know, you know, what outcomes to set from that point. So it's those outcomes. It's saying, okay, 5 outcomes over the, it's probably late in the day this year, but 2 or 3 outcomes for the rest of this year, and then 5 outcomes for the new year. What should the outcomes be? What should the provision be? And then try to work from that point. Any report from MPA is going to be massively helpful for that. It's going to be massively helpful to the school in terms of understanding what adjustments could be made to be able to help that. But setting those outcomes as quickly as possible is going to be key. And one of the things about additional training consultancy, so I can see a question there from Larissa. Yes, I cannot, you know, understate enough how many different difficulties and disorders there are out there. And then looking at the significance of all of those difficulties and then understanding how to apply them within the school is almost an impossible profession. You try to, schools, psychologists, local authorities try to deal with everything as objectively as possible. They look at the diagnoses, they look at the outcomes. But the child's subjective experience of the world can often derail all of those things, and best laid plans often don't go well, you know, and it's about ever decreasing circles to try to get to that point where it is as successful as possible. So it's almost impossible to be trained up on everything, but then it's about requesting extra support, and a local authority will ask for that too. You know, what advice has a school sought over time? You know, who have they sought advice from? If it's an early stage, how has the school used that budget? So sometimes it can be the SENDCo that has received extra training and then that's applied for the child. Sometimes they've requested an external professional. In the grand scheme of things, an assessment isn't expensive, and sometimes the school needs support and understanding how they budget for external assessments, and that because if they're expecting the child to be there for a number of years, that budgeting for an assessment for a child, for an individual psychology assessment, can be budgeted over a number of years. Sometimes schools and business managers need help with understanding how that can work financially. It can be done, but go on.
Oh no, sorry. All I was going to say was we've only got a couple of minutes left.
Oh.
Don't have to stop dead on past. It's just that's how long I said the meeting was for. The only things that I wanted to say before we finish are in the chat. I posted at 1806, so you have to go up a little bit. I said so all the links to things that we've been talking about and information and bits of this presentation. So we recorded it, but we'll just take snippets out of us talking. Will be posted in that group. So there's a link there. The group is kind of within our community system, so you can join the community and then post questions in the group. So if you've got things that you want to ask that you haven't asked today, you can sign up, join the community, and then post a question. We might answer it in the group, or perhaps come back to it in some future talk. We haven't got any more talks planned this minute. These were kind of two together, like the previous one about ADHD, which we've done a summary of, and you can get you can see the video or get the link to the video from that group that you can access. And so that was the previous one, and then this one is a kind of follow-up looking at, okay, so why do all these things go wrong so much? Basically is the kind of theme of it, which I suppose one way or another I think probably we've covered at least most of the reasons why they go wrong, and boy do they go wrong, I think is the issue. what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh yeah, you said something about a minute ago, Matt, just made me think. Oh, hang on, Tom's posted before we finish, the likelihood of sisters and brothers copying the neurodivergent behaviour. Yeah, I mean, it's not a myth, but it probably doesn't happen as much as people say. You know, yeah, kids will, yeah, that's normal. Kids copying other kids' behaviour, that happens all the time. In lots of circumstances, it's helpful. So one of the things that we see is just social norming. So toddlers in nursery will sit down and have their lunch, and then you get them home and they don't do it at home, right? that's because they're copying each other. So yeah, copying each other is a thing. And I suppose, you know, if you've got a kind of a sibling that does obviously kind of more aggressive behaviour and so on, then yeah, there's going to be some increased chance that siblings will engage in similar behaviour. So yeah, it's going to influence one sibling's behaviour will influence the other siblings. In the end, though, my question is always, okay, well that's possible, but if sibling A has got a neurodevelopmental disorder, the likelihood of sibling B also having a neurodevelopmental disorder is way higher than the general population, and the assessment then needs to be done of is it a neurodevelopmental disorder? It's always the same set of questions, regardless of whether they may or may not be copying their sibling. Yeah, that's just another factor in the picture. The one other thing I was just going to say, which is also slightly off topic, but Matt made me think of it when you said about that the number of different kind of conditions is huge, and how can you so the number of children that we see who have rare disorders is surprisingly high, and the reason is that rare disorders are rare, but rare disorder patients are common. It's a rare disorder saying, and that's because there are loads of rare disorders. There are thousands and thousands of rare disorders. So it's quite, lots of people have a rare disorder, they just don't have the same one. And maybe that's a topic. There's a little bit about it on the community site, because it has come up a few times. And the other thing, so rare disorders, or SWAN, syndrome without a name, that's the other one. It's where it's like, yeah, there's a syndrome here, doesn't have a name because we haven't seen it before. That's also quite common because the nature of human variability is practically infinite. So yeah, these are things that a fair few parents would have had experience of, and that's kind of goes into this very broad issue of kind of wider comorbidity. Everything from connective tissue disorders, glue ear, autoimmune disorders, etc., etc., etc. Wider children. This is again due to biogenetics or genetics mainly. So maybe those are things for future talks. I think we could maybe say something about those if people wanted to. I'll have a think about what the things are that people most commonly experience. I suppose glue ear, that's one that just comes up a lot. Then wondering, okay, so was their language delay because their hearing was impaired? That's a fair enough question. It's that kind of thing that I guess people are often wondering about. Okay, anyway, we're now over time. Was there anything, Matt, from you before we finish up?
No, but if anybody wants to ask any questions in the chat remains open, and then Josh and we can always do an extra recording if anything crops up later. If you want to send us an email, but also if you want talks on anything else, we've covered ADHD and attachment, but we know full well that isn't the entirety of difficulties in SEN in this country. So if there are things that you want help with, not just in terms of individual SEN, but in terms of schools and colleges and universities and adjustments and development of organisations, we're happy to help out in these areas, and just ping us a message.